Hello, this is our lecture 19, and we're going to be discussing some of the basic features of the cerebral cortex. If you take a look at this slide right here, this is our human brain. Here's the cerebellum that you see here, the old brain here. This is the cortex that we liken that to, some of the top scoops, certainly the frontal cortical area that you see right here of the brain. Go back to that ice cream scoop analogy that I talked about before. There's clearly a lot of attention that has been directed by researchers in the field of behavioral neuroscience to understand both the structure and the function, of the cerebral cortex. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in this lecture today. So a few basics in terms of the cerebral cortex. It is the most prominent part of the brain. And it consists of these cellular layers that we're going to be talking about, these gray matter and white matter. We have two hemispheres to the brain that appear to be mirror images of each other, but when we get to the whole area of what we call laterality, we're going to find that the two hemispheres of the brain really have very different functions. Those two hemispheres are connected to one another by this, what is called the corpus callosum that you see right here, as well as the anterior commissure and the posterior commissure. These are bundles of axons that connect the two hemispheres of the brain. So clearly, in the case of human beings, this part of the brain, the cortex, the cerebral cortex, and in particular frontal cortex, is much more highly developed. And we'll take a look at some of these comparisons between species as we go along. So if we were comparing mammalian brains, the human brain is really the largest of all. Take a look at the human brain here. It's the largest of those that are shown here. We know whales and dolphins and elephants have larger brains, but our brain, the human brain, really has much more devoted to frontal cortex than other mammals. But it's important to note that we as mammals have the same brain subareas in pretty much the same locations. Again, here's our cerebellum, here's our frontal cortical area that you see here. Well, take a look at a zebra. Here's the cerebellum that you see here. Here's the frontal area. Take a look at the raccoon. Here's the frontal area. Here's the cerebellum that you see here. Again, across many different species, that the brain subareas are pretty much in the same location. Here's an interesting figure. This shows the relationship between the volume of the cortex of the brain, the smart part of the brain, and the volume of the rest of the brain. And if you take a look at that, you see this very interesting upward sloping curve here when you begin to take a look at the size of the cortex relative to the size of the brain. This upward deflection means that more of the brain is being devoted to cortex. That is, a greater proportion of the brain is cortex as you go up the so-called phylogenetic tree. Take a look at marmosets, apes, humans. Again, you're getting this upward deflection. Here are infrahuman primates that are considered not to be as advanced. So again, this upward deflection means that more of our brain is being devoted to this smart part, this frontal cortical area. Here's another important figure. If we take a look at the 5 basic areas of the brain, we call them the telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, medulla, and cerebellum. The cerebellum is relatively constant across species, consists of about 13% of our brain is devoted to cerebellum. The forebrain, that smart part, the telencephalon, that's a larger percentage of primate brain than, for example, insectivore brains. So the telencephalon there is this light blue. Here it is in primates. Here it is in the case of insectivores, and indeed much more devoted to that smart part in primates in comparison, in this case, to insectivores. So again, that's another important piece of information. So when we take a look at the organization of the cerebral cortex, it contains what we call laminal layers, and they run parallel to the surface of the cortex. I'll have another figure for this a little bit later on that will show this, but these are the 6 laminal layers that you see here. Again, this is as if we had taken a coring right from this area that you see right here. So we have those distinct layers. Again, we call them laminal layers. What we also know is that the cells of the cortex are divided into columns, like what you see here. And they lie perpendicular to those laminal layers that you see right here. Here's the laminal layers, okay? And here's these, they almost look like silos, these columns, and they lie perpendicular to the lamina. And third basic thing, we have 4 lobes of the brain. Here's our frontal lobe that you see right here. Here's the parietal lobe that you see here. Here's the occipital lobe that you see right here. And here is the temporal lobe. So again, the cerebral cortex and these 6 laminal layers. Again, here's the surface that you see right here. This is now deep inside the brain. This is molecular layer 1, mostly dendrites and long axons. Then we have this external granular layer, this second layer in which we have relatively small pyramidal cells. Then we have what's called the pyramidal cell layer that you see right here, principally pyramidal cells. Then the internal granular layer that you see right here. These are relatively small cells. Then the interpyramidal layer that you see right here. These are large pyramidal cells. And then what's called the multiform layer in which you see principally spindle cells. So these columns in the cerebral cortex, again, I refer to them as silos because I think that's kind of what they look like. They go through several different laminal layers. And typically the neurons that you see within each one of those columns have very similar properties. And again, here's our surface of the cortex. Here's our white matter here. Here's these columns, these silos. As an example, the somatosensory cortex, all the neurons in a given column in the somatosensory cortex respond to the same type of stimulation, the same area of the skin. Here's our 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex, and again, it's worth, I think, going over these, just briefly so that you, again, can hang your hat on something. Here's our frontal lobe that we see here, higher decision-making processing that is occurring. This is the precentral gyrus area of the prefrontal lobe. This is our motor cortex that is right here. This is called the central sulcus, which divides the precentral gyrus from the postcentral gyrus. Postcentral gyrus is primarily what we call somatosensory cortical area, parietal lobe, mediating body sensations. The occipital lobe that we see here, also called the striate cortex, is involved in visual processing. And then the temporal lobe that we see here, which is involved with principally with hearing, but also certain types of visual processing, namely things like face recognition. And again, this visual that you see here, I think, is important. This is showing our different senses. and where they are principally being mediated. Here's, you know, the auditory cortex that you see right here. Right here, the olfactory bulb and our sense of smell, we call olfaction, vision, primarily in the back of the brain, and the striate cortex, the movement and somatothesis. This is in the somatosensory, both somatosensory and motor area of the brain. So a little bit about each one of these lobes so you can have something to hang your hat on. Here's our occipital lobe that we see right here. This is, you know, the most posterior part of the cortex, and again, some call it the primary visual cortex, some call it the striate cortex, but obviously it's involved in mediating visual input. And we'll talk more about this when we specifically get into the area of vision. If that area of the brain is damaged, it can result in what's called cortical blindness, meaning that your eyes are working fine, but what happens in the back of the brain, in the occipital cortex, because of that damage, you know, you can't see. Okay, because again, that's the first relay station. When we begin to talk about vision, we're gonna be talking about that. The parietal lobe, on the other hand, here's our parietal lobe that we see right here. The primary somatosensory cortex, the postcentral gyrus, that is, you know, right here. It's a target area for touch sensations, a lot of information being transmitted here in terms of receptors throughout the body, joint receptors, for example. It's also very much involved in terms of the processing and integrating of information about the eye. That was something that was not really appreciated until relatively recently. And again, this is research that we'll be taking a look at in a little bit when we get to the whole area of vision. So when we take a look at the sensory and motor information that the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus mediate. Again, here's the precentral gyrus that you see right here. Here is the postcentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus, principally, you know, this is what we call our motor cortex. Postcentral is what we call the somatosensory cortex. Each location in the somatosensory cortex represents sensation from a different part of the body. So if you take a look at, you know, if we were to take a slice of the brain right here, that comes from this area right here. This mediates the intra-abdominal area right here. Here, the pharynx, the tongue, the jaw, the gums, teeth, lips. Again, you know, look at this representation that you see here. And again, this is coming right from this area right here. Here's where information from the toes is being mediated. Again, this map that you see here is one that was generated from a lot of research that was done when these parts of the brain were stimulated. You could see various responses that would occur that were related to these parts of our body. Take a look at the motor cortex, and again, our motor cortex is this area that we see right here, the primary motor cortex. If we were, again, to take a look at this brain slice that you see right here, this area mediates swallowing. This mediates information from the tongue, the jaw, the lips, face, eye, and so on. So again, each location in the motor cortex regulates movement of a different body part. This is an interesting figure which shows how neuroscientists have gone about recording from the somatosensory, recording what we call somatosensory cortical maps. So if we were to stimulate this part of the rat's body, or this area, or this area, or this area, and then record from the brain. We can generate these maps of where that information is being mediated. So different body part colors are represented in areas of the primary somatosensory cortex. Again, those similarly colored dots represent electrode placements. And at the bottom here, you know, this is our final map. You can see, for example, that in the yellow, great part of that area that you see right there mediates information coming from the whiskers of the rat. This area that you see here mediates the pads of the feet of the rat, and the forelimb area. This color right here, the tail. This area, the lips. So indeed, this is how these cortical maps are developed, and they've been developed for a whole array of different species. We can look very precisely at where that stimulation is mediated, again, electrophysiological, by way of electrophysiological recordings that we take from various areas of the cortex of the brain. The temporal lobe that you see here, right here, is our temporal lobe, and principally involved in hearing. Very important for spoken language, but as we will see, also very important for face recognition and other advanced visual processes. The frontal lobe, again, that's this area that we see right here. Prefrontal cortex right here, and the precentral gyrus that we see right here, and primary motor cortex. And this is an integration area in terms of sensory information, and indeed the prefrontal cortical area of the brain critically involved in higher cognitive processing. So our prefrontal cortical area here is about what it looks like in terms of the amount of it that's that we see in the case of the human being. It's responsible for these higher cognitive functions. More recently, we've been finding out that it's involved in working memory, where there's, you know, remembering recent events, for example. A lot of work being done in the area of memory, showing that there's a lot of activation of this part of the brain for recent events. And I'll have an illustration of some of the work that's been done in that area in just a moment. This area of the brain, the prefrontal cortical area, regulates impulsive behaviors. It's involved in more complex behavioral functions. So when we compare across species, in terms of what the prefrontal cortex looks like, in terms of the amount of it that is the amounts that we see relative to human beings and mammals on other parts of the evolutionary phylogenetic scale. Here's squirrel monkeys, here's cats, here's a rhesus monkey, here's chimpanzees, here's dogs. Clearly chimpanzees are the closest to the human being. So this constitutes a relatively large portion of the human brain, certainly much more so in the human being as compared to other species, other mammals. So what is the primary role of the prefrontal cortex? Well, one of the outcomes of that procedure, which is called lobotomy, which you have viewed now, wonderful videotape on the work of Walter Friedman. Individuals who were lobotomized, many of them became apathetic. They had memory disorders, the loss of social inhibitions, loss of emotional expressions. We didn't really learn much from those lobotomies. Indeed, it's a tragic part of the history, really, of science. But more recently, we have understood that the prefrontal cortical area of the brain is involved in some very important behavioral functions. And the primary role really is in this thing that we call working memory. And the example that I like to give is, what if you were in your car and you drove to, let's say, a store, and there was a large parking lot at the store. What allows you to remember where that car has been parked after you finish your shopping? Well, it's our working memory. And indeed, we know that there's a lot of brain activity that occurs in that part of the brain that allows us, that helps us really to remember recent events. This is a very interesting task that you see right here. We'll talk more about this when we get to the area of learning and memory, but this is a chimpanzee that has been placed into this cage where we have these wells that we see here, and we can take some food and then we can cover the food, and we'll cover both of these trays. One will have food, one will not have food. And then we lower this screen that we see here. And maybe we have it lowered for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then we allow that screen to come up, and now the rhesus monkey can reach through the bars, and the question, of course, becomes, does it remember where the food has actually been hidden? And there's a lot of elegant work that has been done, which has shown not only can they remember, but there's a lot of electrophysiological activity that occurs in the frontal cortical area of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex. So a lot of research is focused on the prefrontal cortex being involved in what we call working memory. And that's something that we'll get into in a future lecture. So that's an important it's important that we look at parts of the cerebral cortex to give you a basic understanding of the various structural features and what those parts of the brain are involved in.